Thunder splits the air as the cattle baron storms the auction platform, his voice booming across the stunned crowd. "She's mine!" Then sweeps the black bride onto his stallion, galloping into legend. The townspeople had gathered to witness what they believed was inevitable: the educated woman's final surrender. Despite her dignified bearing and obvious intelligence, they dismissed her as nothing more than property to be claimed, her teaching background mocked as uppity notions above her station. Her fate seemed sealed, a lifetime of servitude to whichever man offered the highest bid. But the towering rancher who thundered into their midst carried secrets that would shatter every assumption. His desperate rescue wasn't random. It was calculated, dangerous, and deeply personal. Hidden legal documents and a 6-month mystery bind their fates together in ways the jeering crowd could never imagine. Will this bold defiance destroy them both? Or does the giant cowboy know something about the trembling bride that could change everything? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Gold Dust Gulch as townsfolk gathered in the dusty square. Serafina Washington stood on the makeshift wooden platform, her back straight despite the jeers echoing around her. The crowd pressed closer, their faces twisted with cruel anticipation. Mayor Whitaker climbed onto a crate beside her, his voice booming across the assembly. He called it a marriage arrangement fair, but everyone knew the truth. This was an auction to settle debts, and Serafina was the prize. The schoolteacher had once commanded respect in this very town. Children had flocked to her lessons, eager to learn reading and arithmetic from the patient woman who treated each student with kindness. That felt like another lifetime now. Judge Harrison had changed everything 3 weeks ago. He arrived with legal papers claiming her former employer owed massive debts to the territorial government. The school closed overnight. Her small savings vanished to pay for boarding and food. Now she faced a choice between marriage to a stranger or destitution on the frontier. The crowd grew restless as men stepped forward to examine her like livestock. Their crude comments about her education being wasted on a woman made her stomach turn. One grizzled prospector suggested she needed humbling. Another claimed book learning made women difficult. Serafina kept her chin raised, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had survived worse than their mockery. The years following emancipation had taught her that dignity was something no one could take away unless she surrendered it. Dorothy Calhoun watched from the crowd, her weathered face creased with worry. The midwife had delivered half the babies in Gold Dust Gulch and tended to countless injuries. Her presence offered the only comfort Serafina could find in the hostile gathering. Mayor Whitaker raised his hands for silence. The bidding would begin with basic household arrangements. Whoever won would gain a wife to cook, clean, and bear children. Education was not required for such duties, he announced to scattered laughter. Judge Harrison stood near the platform, his cold eyes fixed on Serafina. Something about his stare made her skin crawl. This entire arrangement felt orchestrated, though she could not understand why a territorial judge would concern himself with one teacher's fate. The first bid came from a tobacco-stained rancher who owned more cattle than teeth. His offer included room and board in exchange for housework and child-rearing for his 7 sons. The crowd murmured approval at his practical approach. A second man stepped forward. The local blacksmith needed someone to tend his shop and warm his bed. His bid included a small cabin behind his forge where she could live quietly. Several townspeople nodded at this reasonable proposal. Serafina felt her composure beginning to crack as more men joined the bidding. None of them saw her as a person with thoughts and dreams. To them, she was simply a solution to domestic problems, no different from purchasing a milk cow or plow horse. Dorothy caught her eye from the crowd and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. The gesture seemed to carry hidden meaning, though Serafina could not decipher it. The midwife appeared nervous, glancing frequently toward the road leading out of town. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained clear. Several people looked up in confusion at the strange sound growing steadily louder. The noise seemed to come from the earth itself, rhythmic and powerful. Mayor Whitaker continued the proceedings, oblivious to the approaching disturbance. He praised Serafina's ability to read and write, suggesting these skills might prove useful for record-keeping and correspondence. The crowd remained skeptical about the value of an educated wife. The thunder grew deafening as dust clouds appeared on the horizon. Horses and riders approached at breakneck speed, though only one figure dominated the group. Even at a distance, his massive frame commanded attention. Bull Thornfield owned the largest cattle operation in 3 territories. His ranch sprawled across thousands of acres, employing dozens of cowboys and supporting countless head of livestock. Most folks in Gold Dust Gulch knew him only by reputation as a successful but reclusive businessman. The thundering hoofbeats reached the town square as Bull's stallion skidded to a halt near the platform. Dust swirled around the massive horse and its equally imposing rider. The crowd fell silent, uncertain what to make of this dramatic interruption. Bull's eyes locked onto Serafina with an intensity that made her heart race. Recognition flickered across her features, followed immediately by fear. This was not random. This was not coincidence. Mayor Whitaker sputtered protests about the disruption, but his voice carried no authority against the towering cattleman. Judge Harrison stepped forward, his face pale with what looked suspiciously like panic rather than surprise. Bull dismounted in one fluid motion, his boots hitting the dusty ground with finality. Every person in the square seemed to hold their breath as he strode toward the platform where Serafina waited. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then Bull's voice rang out across Gold Dust Gulch, clear and commanding enough to be heard in the next territory. He swept Serafina into his arms before anyone could react, lifting her onto his horse with practiced ease. Her surprised gasp was lost in the chaos as the crowd erupted in shocked exclamations and confused shouts. The stallion wheeled around as Bull mounted behind her, his strong arms encircling her waist. Dorothy Calhoun smiled knowingly from her position near the general store, the only person in town who seemed unsurprised by this turn of events. They galloped out of Gold Dust Gulch with the same dramatic flair that had announced Bull's arrival, leaving behind a square full of bewildered townspeople and 2 very worried officials who suddenly had much larger problems than a simple marriage auction. The stallion's hooves pounded against the hard-packed earth as they raced away from Gold Dust Gulch. Serafina gripped the saddle horn, her heart hammering against her ribs. Bull's arms provided steady support around her waist, but questions swirled through her mind like desert wind. After 20 minutes of hard riding, Bull guided his horse toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a creek. The animal slowed to a walk, then stopped completely in the shade. Steam rose from its flanks as it caught its breath from the desperate escape. Bull dismounted first, then helped Serafina down with gentle hands. She stepped away from him immediately, smoothing her dress and trying to process what had just happened. The familiar weight of his presence both comforted and terrified her. Serafina turned to face him, her dark eyes flashing with confusion and something deeper. Bull removed his hat, revealing the face that had haunted her dreams for 6 months. The scar along his left temple had faded but remained visible, a reminder of everything they had shared and lost. Bull reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded document. The paper looked official, with territorial seals and careful handwriting in formal legal language. He handed it to Serafina without speaking, watching her face as recognition dawned. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the marriage certificate. There were their names, written in Dorothy's careful script, and witnessed by the midwife's signature. The date showed 6 months ago, when the world had been different and hope seemed possible. The memories flooded back like water through a broken dam. Bull had arrived at the Harrison Ranch more dead than alive, 3 bullet wounds from cattle rustlers painting his shirt crimson. Judge Harrison was away on territorial business, leaving Serafina to tend the injured stranger. She had cleaned his wounds with gentle efficiency, her teaching background having taught her basic medical care from necessity. The bullets had missed vital organs, but infection threatened his life for days. Serafina sat beside his bed, changing bandages and forcing medicine down his throat when fever made him delirious. During his recovery, they talked for hours. Bull discovered her sharp mind and quick wit beneath the reserved exterior. Serafina found herself drawn to his quiet strength and unexpected vulnerability. He treated her as an equal, something few men had ever done. Their attraction grew slowly, built on mutual respect and shared conversations about books, dreams, and the changing world around them. Bull confessed his loneliness running the vast ranch with only hired hands for company. Serafina admitted her fears about her uncertain future as a freed woman in a hostile territory. The marriage proposal came naturally after weeks of companionship. Bull offered security and partnership rather than ownership. Serafina saw a chance for the kind of life she had never dared imagine. Dorothy performed the ceremony in secret, knowing the town would never accept their union. Their happiness lasted exactly 3 days. Judge Harrison returned early from his trip and discovered them together in Bull's recovered state. His rage was immediate and terrifying. He threatened to have Bull killed by hired guns unless Serafina disappeared forever. Serafina made the choice to protect the man she loved. She slipped away before dawn, leaving behind a note explaining nothing. Bull woke to find his wife gone and no trace of where she might have fled. Dorothy claimed ignorance when he demanded answers. Bull searched for months, visiting every settlement and town within riding distance. He hired investigators and followed false leads until his resources ran thin. The woman who had become his whole world had vanished like smoke in the wind. Judge Harrison convinced the town that Serafina had simply moved on to seek better opportunities. Her teaching position was filled by a minister's daughter from back east. Most people forgot about her within weeks, but Bull never stopped looking. Serafina found work as a seamstress in a settlement 2 territories away. She used her maiden name and avoided questions about her past. Every night she wondered if Bull was safe and whether Judge Harrison had carried out his threats. The summons back to Gold Dust Gulch came through official channels. Judge Harrison claimed she owed debts to her former employer's estate that required immediate settlement. She knew it was a trap, but had no choice except to comply or become a fugitive. Dorothy appeared through the cottonwood trees, leading a gentle mare and carrying a leather satchel. Her weathered face showed relief at finding them both alive and unharmed. She had been watching the road since Bull rode out of town like thunder incarnate. The midwife produced the original marriage certificate from her satchel, along with other documents she had kept hidden for months. Bank records showed deposits Bull had made in Serafina's name. Property deeds listed her as co-owner of the vast Thornfield Ranch. Dorothy explained how she had spent months gathering evidence and preparing for this day. She knew Judge Harrison would eventually force a confrontation, and she wanted legal ammunition when the battle came. The marriage was valid under territorial law, making Serafina one of the wealthiest women in 3 states. Bull took Serafina's hands in his calloused palms, his blue eyes intense with emotion. She had protected him by leaving, but now they faced danger together. The ranch that had been his life's work was legally half hers, a fact that would infuriate every man who had bid on her that morning. The sound of approaching horses echoed across the plains. Judge Harrison and Mayor Whitaker rode hard with 6 armed men, their faces grim with purpose. The confrontation Serafina had tried to avoid was about to begin whether they were ready or not. The riders thundered into the grove with dust swirling around their horses. Judge Harrison led the group, his face twisted with fury at finding his carefully orchestrated plan disrupted. Mayor Whitaker flanked him, sweating despite the cool shade of the cottonwoods. 6 armed men spread out in a semicircle, their hands resting near their weapons. These were not town deputies, but hired guns brought in from outside territories. Their cold eyes and weathered faces spoke of men accustomed to violence as a business transaction. Judge Harrison dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and threatening. He pointed an accusing finger at Bull while addressing Serafina as if she were a wayward child who had forgotten her place in the world. The judge declared the marriage certificate fraudulent, claiming Serafina had been coerced while Bull lay injured and delirious. No woman of her background could consent to such an arrangement, he argued. The document was worthless paper that would never hold up in territorial court. Serafina stepped forward before Bull could respond. Her voice carried clearly across the grove as she challenged the judge's legal authority to make such determinations. She cited specific territorial statutes regarding marriage contracts and witness requirements with the precision of a trained lawyer. The months she had spent caring for Judge Harrison's extensive law library had not been wasted. While dusting shelves and organizing documents, She had absorbed legal concepts and territorial regulations. Her teaching background had prepared her mind to retain and apply complex information. Judge Harrison sputtered in surprise at her detailed knowledge of property law and marriage regulations. He had expected a frightened woman who would submit to male authority without question. Instead, he faced someone who could match his legal arguments point by point. Serafina produced the marriage certificate and pointed out Dorothy's signature as a legally recognized witness. The midwife was a respected member of the community whose testimony carried weight in any territorial court. The document bore proper seals and followed all required procedures. The judge's face reddened as Serafina systematically dismantled his arguments. She quoted case law from territorial Supreme Court decisions and referenced federal statutes governing marriage contracts. Her education had extended far beyond basic reading and arithmetic. Mayor Whitaker tried to support the judge by claiming the entire marriage was a scheme to defraud the town of Serafina's labor obligations. She owed debts that required settlement through the marriage auction, he insisted. No secret ceremony could supersede those legal responsibilities. Dorothy stepped forward with her leather satchel, producing documents that shattered the mayor's claims. Bank records showed Bull had been depositing money in Serafina's name for months, covering any debts attributed to her former employer's estate. The financial obligations had been satisfied in full. The hired gunmen grew restless as the legal discussion continued. They had been paid to intimidate and threaten, not listen to territorial law debates. Their leader, a scarred man with dead eyes, suggested they resolve matters more directly. Judge Harrison raised his hand to silence the gunman, but desperation crept into his voice. He spoke of powerful business interests that required Bull's land for territorial development. The marriage complicated legal proceedings that were already in motion through official channels. Serafina caught the slip immediately. She pressed the judge about these mysterious business interests and their connection to her forced auction. Why would territorial development require fraudulent marriage ceremonies and hired intimidation tactics? The judge realized his mistake as soon as the words left his mouth. He attempted to backtrack, claiming he misspoke about routine territorial planning, but Serafina's sharp questions revealed gaps in his explanations that grew wider with each response. Bull remained silent, following Serafina's lead as she conducted the legal battle. His role was protection rather than confrontation, and he positioned himself to shield both women if violence erupted. The hired guns watched him carefully, recognizing a dangerous opponent despite the peaceful setting. Dorothy produced additional documentation from her satchel, including correspondence she had intercepted between Judge Harrison and unknown parties. The letters referenced land acquisition projects and systematic removal of property owners through legal manipulation. Judge Harrison's composure cracked as he recognized his own handwriting on the intercepted documents. He demanded to know how Dorothy had obtained private correspondence, threatening her with charges of theft and mail tampering. The midwife smiled grimly as she explained her network of contacts throughout the territory. Women who cleaned offices, cooked for officials, and tended to injured men heard many things that powerful people assumed went unnoticed. Information flowed through these invisible channels like water finding its course. Serafina realized they faced something far larger than personal animosity or local corruption. The systematic nature of the land acquisition scheme suggested coordination at the territorial level. Bull's ranch was valuable enough to justify elaborate legal manipulations and hired enforcement. The judge made a final desperate gambit, ordering his men to arrest Bull for kidnapping and Serafina for fleeing legal obligations. The hired guns moved forward, hands dropping to their weapons as tension filled the grove like smoke. Bull stepped protectively in front of Serafina, his own hand moving to the pistol at his hip. The mathematical certainty of violence hung in the air as both sides calculated odds and consequences. 6 against 2, with Dorothy caught in the crossfire. Dorothy raised her voice above the mounting tension, announcing that copies of all documents had been sent to the territorial capital. If anything happened to them, investigators would know exactly where to begin their inquiry. The judge's schemes were already exposed to higher authorities. Judge Harrison hesitated, weighing his options as the hired guns awaited orders. The situation had spiraled beyond his control, but retreat might mean exposure of the larger conspiracy. He faced a choice between immediate violence and long-term consequences. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring before Judge Harrison finally signaled his men to lower their weapons. This confrontation was over, but his parting words carried the weight of promise rather than threat. Larger forces were involved, and the couple had merely won the first skirmish in a much bigger war. The Thornfield Ranch sprawled across the valley like a small kingdom, its boundaries marked by wooden fences that stretched beyond the horizon. Bull led Serafina through the main gate as evening shadows painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. The magnitude of what was now legally half hers took her breath away. Dorothy had ridden ahead to prepare the main house, her saddlebags filled with documents that would change everything. The midwife understood the gravity of what they had discovered in Judge Harrison's correspondence. This conspiracy reached far beyond Gold Dust Gulch, into the highest levels of territorial government. Serafina spent the first night studying every paper Dorothy had collected over the months. Her teaching background served her well as she organized information chronologically and identified patterns that revealed the true scope of the scheme. What she discovered made her stomach turn with disgust. The railroad consortium had been operating for 2 years, systematically targeting large landowners across 3 territories. Their method was elegant in its cruelty. They identified valuable properties along planned rail routes, then used corrupt officials to create legal complications for the owners. Some families faced fraudulent debt claims that forced property sales at below-market prices. Others discovered their land grants had been mysteriously invalidated due to paperwork errors that materialized decades after the original purchases. The most vulnerable owners simply disappeared, leaving their property to be claimed by the territorial government. Bull's Ranch represented the largest single prize in their operation. The planned transcontinental railroad would run directly through his best grazing land, making the property worth millions in future development rights. The consortium needed him gone to complete their western expansion plans. Serafina realized why Judge Harrison had orchestrated such an elaborate scheme to separate them. An unmarried woman could be easily manipulated or eliminated, but a legal wife with property rights created complications that threatened their entire operation. Her education made her particularly dangerous to their plans. The documents revealed names that shocked her. Territorial senators, federal land commissioners, and prominent businessmen from back east were all involved in the conspiracy. They had been stealing land on a massive scale, enriching themselves while destroying families and communities. Dorothy arrived the next morning with 3 other women who had been secretly documenting similar activities in neighboring settlements. Each carried evidence of families destroyed by the railroad consortium's systematic theft. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering in its breadth and cruelty. Martha Hendricks had lost her husband's cattle ranch after mysterious debt claims appeared following his death in a riding accident. The widow discovered that territorial records showed debts that never existed while her husband was alive. She was forced to sell for a fraction of the property's value. Sarah McKinnon's family farm was seized when their original land grant was declared invalid, due to a surveying error that appeared 20 years after the purchase. The consortium immediately bought the property from the territorial government at auction, paying pennies on the dollar for valuable agricultural land. Rebecca Torres faced fraudulent marriage claims when a stranger appeared with documents showing she was legally wed to him rather than her actual husband. The territorial court accepted the false papers despite her protests, leaving her family with no legal standing to keep their homestead. Each story followed the same pattern of legal manipulation backed by corrupt officials and enforced by hired intimidation. Families who resisted faced violence or mysterious accidents that eliminated opposition. The consortium operated with impunity because they controlled the very system designed to protect property rights. Serafina organized the evidence into categories that revealed the conspiracy's structure. She identified key players, documented their methods, and traced financial connections between the railroad company and corrupt territorial officials. Her teaching skills proved invaluable for creating a comprehensive case. Bull provided resources and protection while Serafina developed their strategy. He sent trusted ranch hands to gather additional evidence and locate other affected families. His network of contacts throughout the cattle industry proved invaluable for building their coalition. The couple worked side by side as equal partners, their relationship deepening through shared purpose. Bull treated Serafina's legal expertise with the same respect he showed his best ranch foreman. She embraced her role as co-owner, making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and thousands of cattle. Dorothy's network expanded daily as word spread about their investigation. Women throughout the territory who cleaned offices, cooked for officials, and tended to sick families began sharing information they had collected without realizing its importance. The invisible network of domestic workers became their most valuable intelligence source. The ranch became a gathering place for displaced families and allies committed to fighting the conspiracy. Serafina established a school for the children while teaching adults about their legal rights. Bull provided shelter and employment for those who had lost everything to the railroad scheme. But their success attracted dangerous attention. Strange riders were spotted watching the ranch from distant hills. Cattle began disappearing from remote pastures, and fences were cut during night raids. The consortium was escalating their intimidation tactics in response to the growing resistance. Judge Harrison sent official warnings about harboring fugitives and interfering with territorial development projects. He threatened to bring federal marshals to arrest everyone on the ranch for conspiracy and sedition. The legal pressure mounted as their investigation gained momentum. Serafina discovered the most damaging evidence in a bundle of letters Dorothy had obtained from a corrupt land commissioner's office. The correspondence revealed specific plans to eliminate her and Bull if legal manipulation failed to secure their property. The consortium had decided that murder was preferable to continued legal complications. The territorial capital received word of their investigation through Dorothy's extended network. A federal judge was traveling west to review land grant irregularities reported by affected families. They had 3 days to present their evidence before the consortium could suppress the investigation through political pressure. Time was running out as powerful forces mobilized to destroy them before the truth could reach federal authorities. Dawn broke over the Thornfield Ranch as families gathered from across 3 territories. Wagons rolled through the main gate carrying displaced homesteaders, widowed mothers, and men who had lost everything to the railroad conspiracy. The ranch house buzzed with quiet determination as people prepared for their journey to Fort Prosperity. Serafina stood in the main parlor surrounded by carefully organized stacks of evidence. Each document had been cataloged and cross-referenced to build an unshakable case against the consortium. Her teaching background proved invaluable as she prepared presentations that even illiterate ranchers could understand and deliver. Martha Hendricks practiced her testimony about the fraudulent debt claims that had stolen her late husband's cattle operation. Serafina coached her through the legal terminology and helped her organize dates and financial records that proved the conspiracy's methods. The widow's hands shook as she rehearsed, but her voice grew stronger with each repetition. Sarah McKinnon studied the surveying documents that had been used to invalidate her family's land grant. Serafina taught her to identify the telltale signs of forgery and backdating that revealed the consortium's manipulation. The farmer's wife memorized every detail until she could recite the evidence without referring to notes. Rebecca Torres prepared to explain how false marriage documents had been used to steal her homestead. Serafina helped her understand the legal requirements that the fraudulent papers had failed to meet. The young mother clutched her real marriage certificate like a lifeline as she practiced her presentation. Bull coordinated the logistics of moving 60 people and their evidence safely to the territorial capital. His most trusted ranch hands would escort the wagons while others remained behind to protect the property from anticipated retaliation. The consortium would not allow this challenge to proceed unopposed. Dorothy organized the women's network to ensure continuous communication between Fort Prosperity and the scattered settlements. Messages would flow through the invisible channels that connected domestic workers, midwives, and shopkeepers across hundreds of miles. Information was their most powerful weapon against corruption. The journey began before sunrise to avoid the worst heat and potential ambushes. Serafina rode beside Bull at the head of the column, her saddlebags filled with the most damaging evidence against Judge Harrison and his Confederates. The original railroad correspondence would expose the conspiracy's scope to federal investigators. Strange riders shadowed their progress from distant ridgelines, but Bull's armed escorts discouraged direct confrontation. The consortium preferred legal manipulation to open violence, but desperation might change their tactics. Everyone understood they were traveling toward either justice or disaster. Judge Harrison's final intimidation attempt came through official channels as they neared Fort Prosperity. A territorial marshal delivered warrants for Bull and Serafina's arrest on charges of inciting rebellion and interfering with government operations. The legal documents bore impressive seals, but lacked specific evidence supporting the accusations. Serafina studied the warrants with the critical eye she had developed through months of legal research. The charges were deliberately vague and relied on judicial discretion rather than statutory violations. Judge Harrison was gambling that federal authorities would defer to local territorial officials rather than investigate the underlying conspiracy. The federal courthouse in Fort Prosperity was packed beyond capacity when they arrived. News of the land grab conspiracy had spread through the territorial press, drawing attention from politicians and businessmen who suddenly worried about their own property rights. The courtroom buzzed with nervous energy as people realized the case's implications. Federal Judge Samuel Morrison had traveled from the Eastern Territories specifically to investigate the land grant irregularities. His reputation for incorruptible honesty had made him enemies among political machines that relied on patronage and favoritism. The consortium had tried unsuccessfully to have him replaced with a more cooperative official. Serafina organized the affected families into a coordinated presentation that would systematically expose the conspiracy's methods and scope. Each testimony would build upon previous evidence to create an overwhelming case for federal intervention. Her strategic mind had transformed individual grievances into a powerful legal assault. The Railroad Consortium's representatives filled the front rows with expensive lawyers and political allies. They projected confidence that their connections and resources would prevail over a collection of farmers and ranchers. Their underestimation of Serafina's capabilities would prove costly. Bull provided moral support as Serafina prepared for the most important presentation of her life. His quiet strength steadied her nerves as she reviewed her notes one final time. The partnership they had built through months of shared struggle would face its ultimate test in federal court. Dorothy's intelligence network reported last-minute attempts to bribe court officials and intimidate witnesses. The consortium was pulling every string available to prevent the evidence from reaching Judge Morrison. Their desperation suggested the conspiracy reached even higher into territorial government than previously suspected. Martha Hendricks opened the testimony with her account of fraudulent debt manipulation. Her voice remained steady as she presented financial records that proved the consortium's methods. Federal investigators took detailed notes as she methodically destroyed the legal justifications for seizing her property. Sarah McKinnon followed with evidence of backdated surveying documents and forged territorial seals. Her presentation revealed the technical methods used to invalidate legitimate land grants. The courtroom stirred as people recognized similar tactics used against their own families. Rebecca Torres delivered devastating testimony about false marriage documents and identity theft. Her evidence exposed the consortium's willingness to destroy families through the most intimate legal violations. Several women in the audience wept as they recognized their own experiences in her account. The consortium's lawyers attempted to discredit each witness through personal attacks and procedural objections. But Serafina had prepared the families too well for such tactics to succeed. Every challenge was met with documented evidence and legal precedent that supported their claims. Judge Morrison's expression grew increasingly grim as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The evidence suggested systematic corruption that threatened the foundation of territorial law and property rights. Serafina rose from her seat in the packed courtroom, carrying the leather portfolio that contained 2 years of documented conspiracy. The Railroad Consortium's expensive lawyers watched nervously as she approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone who had mastered every detail of territorial law through necessity and determination. Her presentation began with the original correspondence Dorothy had intercepted from Judge Harrison's office. The letters revealed specific instructions from railroad executives to corrupt territorial officials about eliminating property owners along planned rail routes. Each document was read aloud in Serafina's clear, educated voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. Federal Judge Morrison leaned forward as Serafina systematically connected the conspiracy's financial network. Bank records showed payments from Eastern Railroad interests to territorial judges, land commissioners, and local officials. The money trail exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. The railroad lawyers attempted to discredit her evidence through technical objections about document authenticity and chain of custody. Serafina demolished each challenge with legal precedent and procedural knowledge that surprised even the federal investigators. Her months of self-education had prepared her for exactly this moment. Judge Harrison sat in the gallery with growing panic as his own correspondence was entered into evidence. Letters bearing his signature discussed specific families to be eliminated and properties to be seized through fraudulent legal proceedings. His face grew pale as the scope of his criminal involvement became undeniable. Dorothy took the witness stand to explain how she had obtained the incriminating documents through her network of domestic workers and community contacts. The midwife's testimony revealed a systematic intelligence operation that had been documenting the conspiracy for years. Women throughout the territory had been gathering evidence while remaining invisible to the corrupt officials. The consortium's lead attorney made a desperate attempt to portray the entire case as a coordinated attack on legitimate business development. He argued that territorial expansion required difficult decisions about property rights and that some displacement was inevitable for the greater good. Serafina's response was devastating in its precision. She cited specific federal statutes protecting property rights and constitutional amendments guaranteeing due process. Her legal arguments were delivered with the authority of someone who had earned her knowledge through personal suffering rather than formal education. Bull provided crucial testimony about the intimidation tactics used against families who resisted the land seizures. His detailed account of hired gunmen, mysterious accidents, and violence against property owners revealed the conspiracy's willingness to use force when legal manipulation failed. The courtroom erupted when Mayor Whitaker suddenly bolted from his seat and ran toward the exit doors. Federal marshals caught him before he could escape, and a search of his coat revealed railroad company drafts worth thousands of dollars. The attempted flight confirmed his guilt more effectively than any testimony. Judge Morrison called for order as the mayor was dragged back into custody. The dramatic escape attempt had shattered any remaining credibility the consortium might have maintained. Their corruption was now exposed in the most public manner possible before federal authorities and territorial press. The final blow came when Serafina presented correspondence from Eastern Railroad executives discussing the elimination of her and Bull if legal methods failed to secure their property. The letters contained specific instructions about making their deaths appear accidental while ensuring the ranch could be seized by the territorial government. Judge Harrison made one last desperate gambit by claiming he had been coerced into cooperation by threats against his family. But Serafina produced bank records showing regular payments to his personal accounts over 2 years. The judge's financial enrichment contradicted his claims of reluctant participation. Federal Judge Morrison retired to consider the evidence, while armed marshals took Judge Harrison and Mayor Whitaker into custody. The courtroom buzzed with excitement as people realized they were witnessing the exposure of territorial corruption on an unprecedented scale. The verdict came swiftly and decisively. Judge Morrison declared the land seizures invalid and ordered immediate investigation of the railroad consortium's activities across all Western territories. Federal marshals would ensure that stolen properties were returned to their rightful owners, while corrupt officials faced criminal prosecution. The railroad consortium's representatives fled the courthouse as federal warrants were issued for their arrest. Their carefully constructed network of corruption collapsed within hours as territorial officials scrambled to avoid prosecution by cooperating with federal investigators. 6 months later, the Thornfield, Washington ranch had become a symbol of justice and partnership throughout the Western territories. The property flourished under Serafina and Bull's joint management, proving that equality between spouses created strength rather than weakness. Serafina's schoolhouse stood at the center of the ranch, serving children from dozens of families who had reclaimed their stolen land. Her teaching methods emphasized legal literacy and property rights, ensuring that future generations would be prepared to defend themselves against corruption. Dorothy Calhoun had been appointed as the territorial advocate for women's property rights, using her intelligence network to protect vulnerable families from exploitation. Her official position gave legal authority to work that had been conducted in secret for years. The ranch house porch had become an informal courthouse where families sought help with legal problems and property disputes. Serafina's reputation for fairness and legal expertise drew visitors from across the territory who needed assistance navigating complex regulations. Bull and Serafina sat together on that same porch as the sun set over their restored community. Their dramatic rescue from the marriage auction had become a local legend, but the real story was their partnership in building something lasting from the ashes of corruption. A young couple approached the house carrying legal documents and worried expressions. Their land grant was being challenged by mysterious debt claims that had appeared without explanation. Serafina smiled and invited them inside, knowing that justice was a daily choice rather than a single victory. The wooden sign beside their gate read, "Thornfield, Washington Ranch, legal aid and education available," in letters carved deep enough to last for generations.